Right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Interview Basics, which is part of our Get That Job webinar series here at the Champaign Public Library. My name is Jordan Neal, and I am the career librarian here at the library. So thank you all for joining us this morning. And for any library updates or any news, you could visit us on our website, champaign.org, or you could email us at librarian@champaign.org. You could chat with us, you could give us a call. Moving on to a couple of Zoom features here, there are some icons at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the top, depending on your device. On the far left, you have the options that control your sound or your speaker. Moving to the right and within the center of the window includes a chat and raised hand option. You can use these options to ask any questions or share any comments. You can type your question into the chat or raise your hand and we could unmute you and you can speak and ask your question. I'm sure our presenter will be happy to pause for any questions, but it might be helpful to save them till the end of the presentation. I would like to also remind everyone that most of our webinars are recorded and uploaded to the library's YouTube channel. And then finally, I would like to introduce our presenter, Mike Firmand, who is the Associate Director for Career and Professional Development in the Graduate College here at the University of Illinois here in Urbana-Champaign. In addition to his support of graduate students, Mike has graciously presented on behalf of the library in previous webinars, and I appreciate him joining us again today. So with that, Mike, whenever you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Always happy to present for the library. I enjoy doing it. I am trying to share my screen. There we go. And as Jordan mentioned, please feel free to, interrupt, raise hand, chat, use the chat to ask questions. I'm happy to go through those as they come up. But yeah, happy to be here today talking interview basics. In my role here at the university, there is not a week that goes by that I don't help coach students on interviewing. So it's something I'm very familiar with, and it's something I really enjoy talking about. So I hope you get some good content out of it. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of the different themes or topics that I'm going to go through each one. I'm going to start with the different sort of stages or rounds of the interview process. I'm going to give you some quick advice on what to focus on when preparing, which mainly includes practicing how you answer those questions. Talk briefly on some of those harder questions that are negatively framed or maybe unexpected that may come up in an interview. Talk about your questions that you should ask, and then some day of tips and things to keep in mind when you are doing or at the interview. So let's jump into it with those interview stages. If you've had an interview before, you've been a part of it, typically there are multiple rounds, not universally, but frequently there are different rounds or stages of the interview process. If you're invited for an interview and you get a first round interview, more often than not, that's done by phone or online, virtual, Zoom, web conference. These first round interviews are typically 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes longer, but that's the average, I would say, is about a half an hour. It's often a very structured and scripted process where the interviewer has a set list of questions or things that they need to go through that they're asking each person who is getting an interview at that stage. Because they're very structured and scripted, they will usually leave time for you to ask questions, but it's usually pretty brief. And the main goal of it is to kind of get through what they have to ask you. The audience for who is doing the interviewing can vary at this stage. For larger companies, it might be someone that's in a standalone human resource department or a human resource manager. For smaller companies or medium range, it might actually be the supervisor or people who would be involved directly with the position that you're interviewing for. So some things to keep in mind if you find yourself having a phone or virtual online interview. Say, if you're on the phone, it's okay to have notes, pieces of paper, your resume, things in front of you that you can look at. I would not recommend that you have anything like a script, but it's okay to have some bullet points, something that you could glance at and pick up some information quickly, but nothing that they could hear you shuffling the paper as you're trying to find the thing that you're looking for. If you're on virtual and they can see you, you don't want anything that's underneath you that you would keep looking down to. It would become really obvious. So you could have a couple of things. Maybe there's some Post-it notes or something sticky that you could put on the wall behind the screen that you could look up to quickly and get a quick note to remind yourself of something, but you just don't want anything that's visible or noticeable. It's important to remember on the phone, in all cases, but particularly on the phone, speak slowly and clearly. I say that because, as someone who will find themselves rushing when they're talking, I have identified that on the phone, silence is magnified. When you're interviewing and there's a pause where you can't see someone or you're looking at a blank screen online, that silence feels like it's so much longer than it actually is. So I just want to remind you that, it may feel that way, but it is still okay to pause, collect your thoughts, and go into a sentence in a more clear and grounded place, even if it feels a little awkward. We've got some images on the slide here that have to do with lighting and angle. If you're going to be doing a virtual interview, recommend kind of making to check your lighting so that you are front lit, people can see your face. You may want to consider if you have a laptop or a computer where the camera angle isn't great, using something like a box or some books to lift that up so that the camera is eye level. In my home office, I have a shoebox and a big book that my laptop sits on so that when I'm talking to someone, I'm looking straight and not looking down at them. So something to think about as part of your setup. And then, try to get as quiet or private spaces if you can. If you are going to be having an interview and there are other people in the house that may not be quiet or an animal, that's okay. Just, I would say, tell someone ahead of time, hey, you may hear some voices in the back. I apologize for that. This was the most quiet room I could find. Totally fine. Just get out in front of it by telling them. Now, you've had a first round interview, it went well, but before they may decide to make a decision, you might have a second round or even more round stage of an interview. These, if you've done like a phone or virtual interview first, they might be inviting you to come in person or on site, but many interviews are still being done virtually right now. And the length of how long or what goes into it often really depends on the level of position. I mean, there's just many different possible elements, meetings with different people in the company or the organization, just team members, other people, different stakeholders. They might ask you, depending on the nature of the position, to do a presentation or some sort of demonstration, in person, like very long in-person on-site interviews sometimes involve meals or tours of a facility. Really, I just want to say, chances are a second round interview is going to be a little bit longer than a first round interview. You might be meeting with different people and there are different things they might ask. So it's okay ahead of time if you're unsure if it's just kind of this open-ended 2-hour interview, to ask for some kind of itinerary, to ask for more information, who you'll be speaking with, for how long. There's nothing wrong with trying to get as much information about the process of those longer interviews as you can. All right, so those are kind of the basics of the different stages or rounds of an interview. Let's talk about some tips for preparing. So I would advise, that you know as much as you can know. And this does not mean you have to learn everything and unearth every single article or website or possible piece of information you can find, but know what you can know. Like, go to the organization's website and look for what you can find about their mission or their company philosophy. Know what their service is, know what products they make, know who they serve or what their goals are. Do a Google search or a local newspaper search to see if there are any recent news developments that you can learn about them. That is pretty simple and straightforward. Doesn't mean you have to memorize anything, but get a good idea of who they are and what they're about. What you want to know a little bit like more deeply is what you can find out about the role itself. And by that, I mean, if you applied through, by reading a job ad and there was a job ad posted, I recommend you save that. And before an interview, you review that job ad very closely. I mean, you should know very well the responsibilities and the skills that they listed in that job ad before an interview, because that really is kind of the best artifact or document that you can find that's going to tell you what their priorities are and what they might ask about. But if you've done, a little bit of research and you've read through the job ad a couple of times and feel good about that, really the most important preparation is about practicing answering questions. And I misspelled questions on the slide. That's fantastic. Sorry about that. But your most important preparation is to practice answering those interview questions. So let's talk about those interview questions. This, I find, is what most people get nervous about or have anxiety about when they think about an interview, is what are they going to ask me? I don't know what to expect. You might find yourself like searching online to find each and every possible interview question that someone could say in that moment and think about what your answer might be. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think that's a good approach. While looking up some common questions can be helpful, I don't want you to spend most of your time trying to guess what all possible questions someone is going to ask you. I want you to focus on preparing what you want to say, what you want them to know about you. And so we'll talk about, some questions, and I have some examples here. Sample questions are going to be helpful, but I really want you to have a mindset of when you're preparing is, here are the things I want to say and want them to know, and how can I make sure I get those answers into questions they might ask. So there's typically kind of classified two types of interview questions. The most common one is what we call a behavioral question. This is where they ask you to talk about a past experience or give an example so that they can use your past behavior to predict how you will behave in the future. So if, depending on what the job requires, they will ask about your previous experience doing those things to get a good idea of if you are prepared to do those things in the future. So have some examples there, and I really focus on sort of the ways they start. If you hear a question says, tell us about a time when you blank, describe a situation when you give us an example of a time when. These are all behavioral questions that are calling for you to tell a story, to give an example of a previous experience where you did something similar. Now, there are also what we would call like open-ended questions. Sometimes these are called traditional questions. How they're different is they don't specifically ask for that example in the same way. They are open-ended, they are broad. Tell us your strengths. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Those very common introductory questions of, tell me about yourself, or why do you want this job? This, is a different way that they frame the question. They're not calling for necessarily a specific example or a story. And those can be challenging because you can guess like, how far back should I go, or what all do they want to hear, which can be a challenge. So let's talk about how you approach answering those. I would say whether or not they use the sort of behavioral framing of like, tell us about a time when, or they go to this open-ended, like broad kind of question about, what are your strengths? I would recommend that you still use an answer that tells a story. You would still use an answer that gives an example. The examples are great evidence to how you show them you are prepared to do the job. If you get a behavioral question, it's really easy to say, okay, well, I kind of know they want me to talk about an example where I did a certain kind of thing. I know what they're asking about. If they have a big open-ended question, I want you to think about an example that attaches that, like, related to this job. So if they ask about, well, what are your strengths? One way to answer is to list off all the things you're good at, but that's not particularly compelling. If you might go to your best strength, but maybe that strength isn't, really connected to the job. I can tell them, oh, I'm a great driver. I've never gotten a ticket. I've never gotten an accident. But if the job doesn't require driving, then that strength doesn't really matter. So think about related to this job. So what is your greatest strength related to this job? And I think that can help you think, okay, this is how I find a way to give an example, to tell a story that actually matters to them when they ask this open-ended thing. And they don't need to know everything. I think, again, when something that commonly people get tripped up on is they ask a question and the person answering, they want to answer the question with the most honest story or honest example or honest way to faithfully answer the question. And they don't need to know everything. You don't need to always like pick the answer that tells them exactly what they're asking about. You can just tell them the story that you want to say. So if they say, again, what are your greatest strengths? There might be things that more faithfully answer that question, but there might be a particular strength, a particular story that's better suited for that job. And that's the one you want to tell them. So they don't, you can be selective about what stories or examples you choose to talk about. So let's talk more about those examples. This right here is a framework for how you kind of build and figure out what goes into an example in an interview answer to make sure it's complete, to make sure it's impactful, to make sure it's memorable. And we like, where I work, this thing called the CAR method. CAR, C-A-R, standing for context, action, result. Those are the three pieces that you want to have in every example, in every story that you tell when you're answering an interview question. So I'm going to go through piece by piece. The C stands for context, which should be first and should be the smallest part. This is just like a sentence or two telling the interviewer sort of who you were and what you were doing at the time of this example. You can also think of the C as standing for challenge. So this was your challenge. This was the task or the goal in front of you. So while I was working at this company, I had to do this thing. I had to do this challenge to try and make this customer happy. Boom, there it is. That's all the context you really need. Just something quick and to the point that tells them who you were and what you were trying to do. Then you transition to the middle part, the A standing for action. This should be the longest part. This should be substantial, where you describe sort of the tasks, the responsibilities, the pieces, the steps you took to like confront the challenge, to make sure that you were doing what you were asked to do. It's also the best place to integrate those skills, what skills you used, what decisions you made, not just what you did, like why you did it that way, to show them your thought process. You probably had different options or things you could do, but telling them why you chose to do things the way you did can be a really powerful way to let them inside your mind and show them how you would act in similar situations going forward. And then once you've kind of come to the action, you need some result. This is a thing where people often leave off. An ending that tells them sort of what accomplishments you may have had. So we solved the problem, everyone's happy, things are great. But I would say sometimes people leave this off because not every story, not every example often has a really nice shiny result, right? Like not everything has some nice, like, oh, in the end, you know, we saved money or 10% productivity improvement or whatever. We don't always have like a metric or a clear result that's like really powerful. So I would say it's okay if your result is just what you learned in the process. It's okay if the result is something about you that you gained. So, you know, you had a challenge, you took action to meet that challenge, you demonstrated your skills and made decisions. And at the end of it, you learned, you grew, and now you know how to do this thing and you can do it going forward. And I think that's a really powerful result as well. So just to give you an idea of a blueprint for how you might practice this is, you know, a very common question that someone might ask is how you work with others, how you work in a team. So thinking about, okay, what was a time where I had to work with other people to do something? What did we need to do? How did I work with them to get it done? And what happened at the end? That's really straightforward, I think really simple. So thinking about those three pieces, context, action, result, and filling that in is a way to have a really nice example for an interview answer. And I could imagine, and I would recommend you do that for other things too, not just the one we have up here. So some practice tips. I can tell you from experience, my sort of biggest tip for practicing these stories and practicing these answers is to do it out loud and to do it often. You know, it can feel unnatural and a little awkward to maybe speak out loud to yourself and talking about yourself, but it is the best way to practice and get really comfortable and really confident talking about yourself and giving these answers. If you have other people you can trust, you know, family members, friends that are willing to listen, great, take advantage of that because it's nice to do it in front of other people to get comfortable with that. If you plan on doing some virtual interviews, you know, get on Zoom and record yourself going through some of these stories or some of these examples, and then you can watch yourself and kind of get a feel for how you're presenting. And I would just say, like, you know, start talking through examples, start talking through stories easily. You can use your resume for this. So if you have your resume, close your eyes, pull out your finger, point down to something, look at it, say, okay, what if someone asked me to talk about this word, this sentence, this thing that's on my resume? What would I want to say if someone said, tell us about this thing? Practice saying that, and then think about how what you said, the story, the example behind the thing you pointed at, could be used for a different kind of answer. Because they may do that. They may say, hey, we see this on your resume. Can you tell us about this? But chances are they're going to ask a different kind of behavioral question or open-ended question. And even though it's asked in a different way, the story is there. Like the thing you may want to talk about is that thing you pointed to. So that's a good way to kind of generate some ideas to say all the things that I've listed here are all the things I already wanted them to know about me. Now, how would I talk about them and give a good full example? And how are those stories useful and good answers for different types of questions? All right. So now we're going to move on to the hard questions. Negative and unexpected questions. Why do interviews ask negative questions? I mean, it happens, and it can feel a little bit like unfair, like a torture test, when it shouldn't be. Well, they want to see how you think on the spot, maybe how you react to some pressure. They want to hear if they're asking behavioral questions about previous difficult situations. They imagine there's going to be some difficult situations in the future, and they want to know how you responded. I'd say also, they don't always realize they're tough. I've been on that side of the table where I've been a part of a hiring process where we asked an interview question about working with a particular population, and every person stumbled that we interviewed on this question. And the reason why is because in the job ad, there was nothing listed about working with that particular population. So these people did their research, they were prepared, and they still got something unexpected that they had no reason to think was coming. And it wasn't willful, it wasn't malicious on part of the interviews. It was just sort of like, we forgot, it forgot to get included in the job ad, and it made for this unexpected tough question. So just say, like, don't always assume they're trying to trick you or put you in a tough spot. Like, they want to hear how you handle negative situation, and they may not realize how difficult the question is from their end of the table. So here are some common negative questions. I would say these 4 here are pretty common. I have been asked each of these questions at some point in an interview. I think the one that people flag the most is that greatest weakness, as being a really hard question to have to talk about something that you're not good at in a space where you're trying to make a good impression on people. So some strategies, you have to answer the question. You can't avoid it, but you got to be honest yet strategic. What does that mean? So, when you get that greatest weakness question, you don't want to say something that's so negative that has them questioning, like, ooh, this is something that may has us questioning whether you can do the job well. But you also don't want to say something that isn't really a weakness. For a long time, people would say something, well, I'm a perfectionist, so that's my weakness, is I want to do everything too perfectly. And I would say employers in interviews kind of treat that rather skeptically. I would say for the greatest weakness, the idea is you want to pick something that you are addressing, that you're working on, that you're learning, that you're growing. And you don't necessarily need to pick something that is a personal failure. One tip that I have for that question is going back to kind of our open-ended question strategies. Think about related to this job. So if you get that question, what's your greatest weakness? You could come back with an answer of, well, when I think about, the first challenge, or the first thing I'm going to have to get up to speed or learn if I were to take this job, is this thing. Like, this component of what you listed in the job ad is something I am not as familiar as I want to be. And so that's something I would need to address right away. So the idea, it's answering the question strategically. It's also telling them something I think that's more important for them to know is, you are thinking about what your biggest weakness is in relation to having to do the job well, but not in a way that really frames it as negative to you. It's showing that you're mentally preparing for what you're going to have to do the job well already. If you get questions about like difficult previous colleagues or employers, and again, it happens, I've been asked it before, try not to badmouth anyone. Try not to say, well, previously I worked at this place and people were just awful. They were unreasonable. Do your best to talk about your own actions, decisions, strategies used to work with people who are challenging. Keep the focus on you. Try to keep it positive. And just know, again, keep your confidence. Try to stay with a good positive energy. If you get like a really negative question, chances are they aren't trying to trick you. Like, they just want to hear how you deal with difficult situations because you're going to face them in any job. There are some questions that I would say are what we call improper. Like it is okay for them to ask things like, are you authorized to work in the United States? Are you at least 18? Are you willing to travel for the job? It is not okay for them to ask specific directed questions sort of about your identity or your personal life in these ways. I will say like sometimes like in a second round interview, you're meeting multiple people, like personal stuff just comes up. Like in interactions, like someone starts talking about a family or what church they go to or something like that. It is entirely your discretion what you choose to divulge, what you include to tell them. Does not mean you can't tell them, but if you get a specifically improper question that you think is out of bounds, there are some strategies you can take. One is to just calmly redirect and say, well, you know, I'd like to focus more on the position and my qualifications. You can ask them why they're asking it. So if they ask a particular question about, it's more about your personal life, you know, can you help me understand how that's relevant or connected to this job? I find that's a nice one for like being a little hint to them as to say like, I'm not assuming you're asking this in a way that's like malicious, but I'm asking this so I can remind you that this isn't something that you should be asking me. And if it's natural, you know, you can use a little humor to deflect and move the conversation along. Again, there's no rule that says you can't talk about these things. There are rules and laws about what they can use to assess you. I am not a legal expert, but I can tell you that it is from an interview, like if you like talk a little bit about your family life or something like that, it is nearly impossible to prove that it was used in any way against you if you do not get the job. So just be prepared if something like this comes up on how you want to address, how you want to redirect this kind of personal identifying information. All right, so moving on, you've thought about and practiced your answers, but you also need to think about and prepare your questions. As I mentioned earlier, very commonly the end of the interview, they're going to ask you, what questions do you have for us? And you should absolutely ask questions. It is part of the interview process. You know, it may be tempting to say, okay, they're done. It can be over. I can get out of this anxious situation now. So I'm just going to say no and move on. But I recommend that you ask questions. So here are some examples of things to ask about. And I think the goal in what you want to ask questions is, again, to show you are thinking about this, like you are mentally preparing yourself for what it would take to come in and do the work, which is a good message to send them. The other thing that's important about asking questions is, you know, an interview is not just a one-way dynamic. Like they are assessing you, you are assessing them. You have some power in this situation, even if it doesn't feel like it. You are not a guaranteed yes, and you are still collecting information to decide, is this the right place? Is this the right job for me? So asking questions helps you do that. So I think, you know, any of these are fine to ask about, like how the position fits within the organization, the amount of interaction with other employees or other customers or stakeholders, people, the plans for how the company or the organization continues to grow or change in the years to come, biggest challenges, what they do for onboarding and training, what employees, you know, how they get along, what the office culture is like. These are all fine things to ask about. I would also think about, you know, think about what you're still curious about that isn't in the job ad. Like job ads are really imperfect. Like they may list all these responsibilities and you have no way of knowing, well, which one will I be doing the most or which one is the most important? So thinking about like, okay, well, what are the things that I will be doing most often? What is a typical week going to look like for me in this job? Some things I would recommend you not asking about. If the salary is not listed, it may be something you're really curious about, but in an interview, I would still not bring it up, not have you be the one to bring it up, because without the leverage of an offer, getting into a salary conversation, can get a little tricky. I think the idea is you want to keep your questions focused on the place, the job in a positive way, and avoid things that have to do with compensation, asking how soon you'll be promoted. Just steer away from that for now. You can ask about, what is a typical trajectory for someone who would enter in at this role? Like, what does a career progression look like? Are there opportunities for professional development? Those are good questions to say, kind of like, hey, I'm thinking about how long I want to be invested here. So what can you invest in me? And again, asking about clarification on the responsibilities, what they look like, the frequency. Those are good questions to ask about. All right, moving right along. So you've done some research, you've practiced answering questions, you've told yourself a lot of stories and thought about your examples. You've got the questions you want to ask ready to go. Now it is actually the day of the interview, and there's still things to do. There's still things to think about. And so I put day of the interview, but this is really actually more like still leading up to, but I think about it in the scope of like final planning. When it comes to traveling, if it's local, leave early, like get there early if you can. Like no one's gonna, like, let me put it this way, when you think of it, the peace of mind you have of arriving to this place that you have to be at a certain time, when you're there, you're just way more at ease. So control for what you can control to avoid, getting stuck behind a train or other things that can happen. Leave as early, to get there as you can. If it's not local, like if you are taking a train or a flight, travel light, nothing that you might have to like stow away and can magically disappear, and all of a sudden now you don't have the clothes you were going to wear, your itinerary or things like that. And just have the name and number of the primary contact. If you're running late, stuff happens, life happens, just let them know. Like, it's okay. Just get out in front of it, tell them. When you think about what to wear, I like to ask people, what makes you feel polished and powerful? Like, what do you feel most confident in? Because that's important too, like, yes, you want to wear something that is professional and respectful, but you also want to feel like your best self. I think a good rule of thumb is to think about what you'd be required to wear in the day-to-day of that job and dress up one level in like professional or formality, like how formal it is, one level up from that. If you are traveling, like look at the weather, think about that ahead of time, make sure you're dressing appropriately for that. Consider the length and the format of the interview. Like if it's going to be on video, see what it looks like on camera, see what it looks like with your background, make sure you're not just like a floating head. Those are all things that are important. I think about shoes a lot. If you get an itinerary and you realize you're going to be having multiple meetings in different rooms or taking a tour of a company site, like think about what kind of shoes you're going to be wearing. All those things matter and can affect how you feel and how you interact with people that day. What to bring? I mean, I'm sort of traditional in this way that I would still recommend getting some kind of folder or like Padfolio where you can bring some copies of your resume or your application materials. You can have a notepad and a thing to write with, to take notes, because it's okay to come with notes. It's okay to come with those questions you thought of ahead of time so that you don't have to like keep them in your head at all times. Like it's okay to write that stuff down or bring out a something and come prepared that way. If there were other components, like you were doing a presentation, like having a backup, if it's some kind of job that, there's any other sort of evidence, previous reports, other samples of your work that are physical that you can bring, just bring them, because why not? You never know when the opportunity might come that you want to show someone something you've done. And I would say, even if you're doing it virtually, like you can think ahead of time about, having something, saved in a Word document that you can drag and drop into the chat that they can download, that you can show them, like, here's a sample thing that I've done. Can be a nice way to kind of have that bringing something feeling, even when you're not physically going somewhere. And then I just want you to think about your audience. They're going to be different people that you meet with throughout those stages. And then you got to be aware of sort of their different expectations. Like in a first round interview, it's 20 minutes. Maybe you find out it's like some human resource manager, like their expectations, what they're trying to find out is like, does this person meet sort of the required qualifications for this job? Can I check the things off that they were asking them to do? But a direct supervisor, who would be the person you report to, they've got other things on their mind. They're thinking, yeah, we are short-staffed. We really need someone. Like, I need someone who's dependable. I need someone that I know is going to show up and do fine. And I don't want to have to start hiring again in a month. So I need someone who I can depend on in that way. A coworker or a colleague is thinking, I want someone I can depend on. I need someone reliable too, but they're also thinking, like, is this someone that I can handle, interacting with more frequently? Is this someone I can enjoy bumping into in the break room, or, being kind of in the trenches of this job with on a day-to-day basis? Those are all things, different things that are all related to the job, but just a different mindset that everyone has. So being aware of that as you're interacting with them is important. And just, be nice to literally everyone, the person at the front desk, or, the person you're getting emails from, maybe you're not meeting with, just be nice to everyone. I shouldn't have to say that, but I'm always surprised at how things can go negative because there was a negative interaction with someone who wasn't involved in an interview process for really no good reason. So just be nice. And then thinking about your body language, it does go a long way to smile, to try to speak clearly and calmly and confidently. Eye contact is one that I get asked a lot about. It's one that I think about a lot in my own kind of world, because we get the question, if you're on Zoom, you're in a Zoom interview, I see this stuff all the time. And they're like, you want to look right at the camera, because if you look at the camera, you're looking at the people. And I'm telling you right now, that's just not a human thing to do, to look into this black, cold circle on my screen when there are other faces. Like a human, I just want to look at another face. You want to pick up those nonverbal cues. So I would tell you, it is okay. You do not have to stare at your camera. We talked about getting at a good eye level, and looking at the screen is totally fine. I think you just want to avoid looking off screen. If you're in person and you're someone who is uncomfortable with eye contact, like myself, I recommend, while someone is speaking to you, look at them in the eye, make good eye contact. And then when it's your turn to talk, and you're going through your answer, then you can kind of look away, look at the room, look across to the different people. You don't have to maintain close eye contact with someone at all times. But I think when they're speaking to you is a good time to focus on that. We'll talk about sort of the stuff you may want to avoid, having good posture, avoiding kind of clicking a pen or swiveling your chair, little things like that you may not notice are important. I am someone who likes to use their hands when they talk and I gesture. I would say, I think it's sort of overblown. Don't feel like you have to hold your hands in and never move them, but maybe get some other feedback or some advice from someone so you're not going too much. Also the filler words, the uhs, the ums, the likes. Again, these are things that I think, unless they are really chronically bad, where you were saying like every other word, that it is not as important as we make them out to be. I would say this, whether it's you're speaking too fast or you notice you're gesturing too much, or you find yourself maybe saying or too much. What I would do is just, that's where you take a pause, you kind of reset, you start your next sentence, you start your next answer sort of at home base in your mind, and you don't think about it again. Because I don't want you to like be so worried about regulating how you're looking, what you're saying, how you're coming off with the or gestures, that it makes you less confident, or that you don't say the things you want to say in your examples, because we all say and we all gesture a little bit, and chances are they're not even going to notice. So don't let it like derail how you want to come off ahead of time. That's just what I'll say. So be aware, but don't let it control how you're coming off. All right, so then after the interview is over, I mean, it's a stressful experience, and it may be tempting again to just completely check out, like step away, turn on the TV, turn on some music and just not think about it. I would say, wait, just hold off a little bit before you do that. I think it's immediately after the interview, because it can be a blur, to take some notes quickly. What did they ask you? Like, were there any surprises? And to think really quickly, in that your own assessment, like, do you still want to work there? Like, did you feel good about the people? Did you feel good about the kind of information you got? Do you feel like you could succeed in that position? That's part of your own assessment. That's part of your own gut check. Like, if they are not doing it in an interview, anything in an interview to entice you, to me, that's a red flag. Like, an interview does not need to be all one way, like, assessment on them. Like, they should be making themselves feel like a welcoming place that you should want to work. Then after you do that, you can check out for a little bit. But what's nice about doing that kind of reflection right away is because you still want to send some thank you correspondence to the people you interviewed with. Like, traditionally, people would handwrite or type out thank you notes. I would say, today, you don't necessarily want to mail a thank you note that may get stuck in the mail for who knows how long, and email is totally fine. Send a little thank you follow-up email to someone. You can wait, like, you don't have to send it like immediately after, but I would say within one day. So if you had an interview that afternoon, the next day, send a thank you email. And if you can, send it to everyone that you had a really like substantive conversation with or interaction with. I know that's not always possible. You may only have like one contact. That's okay. Like, send the thank you email and say, please extend my thanks to the other people, these names who I got to speak with. I really enjoyed hearing from them. You can do that kind of thing so that you're not trying to hunt down emails that you'll never find. And the importance of maybe taking some notes or reflecting right away is because you want that thing to like ring true, to be like personalized. So, think about the questions you asked and like thank them for their honesty or their transparency in explaining that thing that you asked, because all the other people they're interviewing are probably not asking the exact same question. So that's a nice way to personalize. I think in that thank you note, you want to like keep it brief and just basically reaffirm that you're still interested in the position, thank them for the opportunity to interview, add a little personalization, and leave it at that. One thing I didn't mention in the your questions part that I think either in the your questions or the thank you notes you can do is to ask them what the next steps are in the process, or if they need anything else from you. Because I think it's important, for your own mental health, often to ask like, what is their timeline for making a decision? So if the answer to that is, well, we expect to make a decision next week, you'll probably hear from us then, or, well, we have interviews the next 2 weeks and then this person's on vacation, so we won't be making a decision until the next month. Like your own mental health is better when like, okay, it's been 2 weeks and you're not panicking because you asked that question and you know what their process is. You can do that in a thank you note as well. You can say, if you could let me know what your expected timeline is, and if I need to provide any more information, please let me know. That's a good way to get that information as well. All right. I think that's it. Yeah, that's all for my slides and my content, but see, I'm happy to leave time for questions. If anyone has anything, and I can scroll back to other slides if people have questions about that.
Well, thank you, Mike. We always appreciate your time. That was great. Yes, if you have any questions, type them into the chat or raise your hand and we could allow you to speak. I do have one question. I think you mentioned it earlier, but we get a lot of questions here at the library about how to gauge work culture. And do you mind sharing a question on what someone can ask in their interview about work culture?
Great question. And I've got one that I really like. I like the one to ask, how does the company, how does the team, how does whoever, how do you all celebrate success? Like, what do you do when you've had a good day, a good week, a good month, year, whatever? What do you all do to celebrate? How do you measure it and how do you acknowledge it? I think that's really nice way to be indicative of company culture, because it's like, like if they have an answer at all is revealing, and then what they do to kind of recognize, celebrate their employees is a good indicator of like, okay, am I going to feel valued? Do people get along? What does that look like?
Thank you. That's great. I'll write that one down. Well, thanks again, Mike. We have a few minutes. If you want to ask your own questions, here's my contact information here on the screen. As Mike mentioned, of course, you may not know going into an interview what the questions are, but you can focus on what you want to say. We do provide practice interviews here at the library, so you could schedule that with us by reaching out. We could do it virtually or we can do it in person. We have a lot of people record themselves on their smartphones, and they do find that it's helpful. So again, just email me if you're interested. Our next, thank you, first of all, everyone, for joining us this morning. I appreciate seeing you all. So our next career webinar will be career resources at the library, which will be Tuesday, December 28th at 7 p.m. And I will discuss career resources here at the library, including professional development tools, resume assistance, and more as you maintain your career, especially for the new year. And we are excited to share the return of some of our in-person workshops in January. And we have a lot more events here. So just visit our website, champaign.org/events, or you can sign up for our monthly newsletter by visiting champaign.org/news. And if you didn't catch my email address, here is the slide I had earlier. You could just email librarian@champaign.org and it will get to me. You could chat with us, and then you could schedule a book a librarian, not just for career help, but tech assistance, if you're starting or maintaining your business, things like that. So reach out. And once again, Mike, thank you for joining us. We always appreciate you sharing your insights with us. And I don't see any further questions. So I hope everyone enjoys their morning, and I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.